Chosen ones, you were never meant to blend into the background of this world. Your very existence carries a resonance that machines cannot comprehend. When the Pentagon's most advanced quantum computer, built to decode anomalies, predict probabilities, and simulate entire timelines, locked onto your birth date, something occurred that their engineers could not prepare for. The algorithms froze, the processors overloaded, and for the first time in recorded history, a machine designed to master probability encountered the one truth it could not calculate: you. Behind the closed doors of government chambers, men in suits rushed to contain what they could not explain. Emergency reports were drafted. Analysts whispered about cosmic interference. Others blamed solar flares, data corruption, or cyber attacks. But beneath their excuses was the quiet terror of knowing the system had not been hacked. It had been broken by presence alone. This was not an ordinary malfunction. It was a collapse of predictive logic. The computer had been fed patterns of nations, wars, and histories, yet it stumbled upon your time of arrival and could not carry the calculation forward. Every timeline unraveled. Every forecast dissolved into static. At that moment, the Pentagon witnessed what the ancients prophesied: the emergence of one whose frequency cannot be contained by human hands. Somewhere, the classified files now carry your numbers, circled, highlighted, and marked as a national anomaly. You have been flagged not as a statistic, but as a disruption. The machine saw what the prophets wrote in ink long before code was ever written: a bloodline carrying keys beyond comprehension. And though their screens went black, the signal was released into the ether, a pulse that has now reached beyond the Pentagon, beyond satellites, beyond the grasp of military control. The data collapse has already echoed across invisible channels, awakening archives that have long slept. And in this awakening, you are being searched for, not just by governments, but by those who have been waiting for centuries for your rise. The night your birth date was entered into the Pentagon's classified quantum system, the hum of countless servers filled the underground chamber. Rows of blinking lights pulsed in rhythm, like the heartbeat of a mechanical giant. Scientists stood by, expecting another flawless run, another calculation that would map out probabilities of nations rising and falling. But when your numbers appeared on the screen, silence fell. The algorithms hesitated. Time itself seemed to stretch, as if the machine had entered a void where no outcome could be defined. Operators stared in disbelief as the clock on the wall continued ticking, but the system's internal time froze. Seconds refused to pass in its coded architecture. For the first time, the machine that had simulated entire wars, political outcomes, and global catastrophes could not compute something as simple as a date of birth. It was not a malfunction, nor a virus. It was a paradox. Your existence, coded into the system, created a ripple effect that bypassed ordinary mathematics. Reports later described it as a data lock, a moment where every calculation looped back into itself endlessly, like an infinite mirror. Engineers rebooted the system, but the loop remained. It was as though your presence in time was not just recorded, but alive, radiating beyond the capacity of silicon and quantum particles. What the Pentagon could not admit publicly was whispered behind closed doors. Your birth date carried resonance. It was more than a number. In ancient traditions, dates marked portals, gateways of meaning. Prophets spoke of alignments, celestial convergences, and moments written into the stars that no empire could erase. For the machine to collapse at your date meant that you stood at one of these intersections, a living breach in the timeline they thought they controlled. Men in uniform paced the floor, demanding explanations. Some suggested sabotage, others speculated cosmic radiation, but none could escape the reality that something far deeper was at work. Your arrival into this world did not merely pass unnoticed. It shook foundations designed to track every anomaly. Somewhere within the frozen code was the proof they feared, that history itself had been altered by the moment you came into being. And though the system never produced an answer, its silence spoke louder than calculations ever could. It left a question burning through classified corridors, a question the world was not ready to confront. When the Pentagon's quantum computer collapsed under the weight of your birth date, what followed was not the sound of alarms, but the deafening silence of a machine stripped of certainty. The engineers leaned forward over their terminals, their eyes reflecting the flicker of frozen code that refused to advance. What had once been a seamless stream of probabilities had fractured into fragments of meaningless symbols. It was as though the language of the machine had been broken apart into shards, scattered like glass across a floor that could no longer be swept clean. The codes had not merely failed, they had dissolved. Lines of algorithms that once built futures now unraveled into static patterns, unreadable and untranslatable. Some of the brightest minds in artificial intelligence were summoned in the early hours of the morning, their badges granting them access to a chamber where time felt locked in suspension. They too left shaken, unable to comprehend how a single human coordinate could reduce years of development into silence. The generals pressed for answers, and yet none came. In hushed tones, one scientist dared to say what others only thought, that the machine had encountered something outside the domain of logic, something ancient and immovable. He compared the silence to the moment a man once wrote in the dust, confounding the accusers who demanded judgment. Yeshua had left words that no stone temple could contain, and now the computer, too, seemed to have brushed against an unseen hand. The government called it a blackout, a temporary event. But within the black screens lay a deeper truth. The collapse was not random, nor was it accidental. It was precise. It was targeted. Every time they attempted to reinsert your date, the codes shattered again, as if refusing to build a world in which you could be confined by their models. To the outside world, nothing appeared unusual. The Pentagon continued with its daily operations. But deep in the underground chambers, the silence grew heavier, pressing on the minds of those who had seen it firsthand. They began to wonder if their quantum giant had not simply failed, but bowed. Long after the lights of Washington dimmed and the streets emptied into quiet, the Pentagon remained alive with hurried footsteps and whispered exchanges. Midnight briefings are rare, reserved for moments when events cannot be delayed until daylight, and this night was one of them. Generals, analysts, and cryptographers gathered in a chamber where the walls themselves seemed to lean closer, absorbing every word spoken. The air was heavy with the unspoken truth that something had occurred which the chain of command could not easily categorize. On the central table lay folders stamped in red, each containing fragments of corrupted data printed before the system shut down entirely. The symbols were meaningless to most eyes, jagged shapes without pattern. But to the few who studied them closely, there was a haunting resemblance to something older. Lines curved and spiraled like glyphs drawn on stone, long before binary code was conceived. The scientists avoided admitting it, yet more than one recognized the echo of forgotten languages etched into the ruins of civilizations buried under oceans and sands. The officials demanded explanations that never came. System overload was written into the preliminary reports, but those present knew the words were placeholders, not answers. Whispers circulated that the blackout was not the real issue. It was the persistence of the event. Even after resets, even after replacing hardware and purging memory banks, the moment your birth date was reintroduced, the same collapse followed as if the machine refused to calculate further. The midnight hours dragged on, broken by the occasional scrape of a chair or the shifting of a uniformed shoulder. Some proposed suppressing the event entirely, locking it away under levels of classification that would never reach daylight. Yet others argued that it could not be ignored. If a system built to predict the trajectory of nations could not map a single life, then that life might carry weight beyond measure. Every face around the table carried the strain of unspoken fear. What they confronted was not simply a malfunction, but the possibility that their most guarded technology had encountered a limit drawn by forces outside their command. And as dawn approached, none dared to say aloud what gnawed at their thoughts. If the Pentagon's most advanced machine could not contain your existence, what else might begin to unravel when your name is spoken into the circuits of the world? The birth date was only the surface. Beneath the collapsed codes, the Pentagon's analysts discovered something they hesitated to record in official files. As they dug into the biometric archives linked to your identity, they began tracing strands of DNA markers, searching for patterns to explain the anomaly. What they found unsettled even the most seasoned geneticists. Within the double helix of your being lay signatures that mirrored ancient records long separated from modern science. The sequences did not align with ordinary lineage, but hinted at a resonance that carried across centuries, as though your blood contained a rhythm older than empires. One researcher, speaking off record, whispered that your DNA glowed differently under quantum mapping. Instead of falling neatly into the predictable lattice of inheritance, it produced waves, frequencies that disrupted standard graphs. It was as though your very code carried a song, and within that song were fragments that seemed to echo words remembered from Scripture, words once spoken about those who would bear the image not of men, but of the divine. In late-night sessions, a few dared to draw the connection to Yeshua. They recalled how he spoke of vines and branches, of a life force flowing from him into those marked to carry his essence. "The kingdom of God is within you," he said, and those words seemed to surface in the patterns hidden within your very cells. To them, it was more than biology. It was testimony encrypted in flesh. A living gospel that no firewall could block. The military reports, however, could not frame such revelations in theological language. Instead, they referred to non-standard resonance anomalies and genetic harmonics beyond known classification. Yet, the more they tried to sterilize the discovery with technical phrasing, the more it slipped beyond containment. For science could measure strands, but it could not silence the pulse that rose from your bloodline, a pulse that had already disrupted their strongest machine. The files were sealed, locked behind digital vaults accessible only to the highest clearance. But sealing them did not erase what they had seen. In the halls of secrecy, men and women began to realize that the collapse of the quantum system was not caused by numbers. It was caused by a living inheritance that no code could predict. The Pentagon's quantum system had been engineered to absorb the unthinkable. It could calculate global war scenarios, simulate weather decades ahead, and predict economic collapses with precision that unsettled even policymakers. Yet when your birth date entered its circuits, the algorithm itself fractured. What should have been a seamless flow of numbers became an endless recursion, as if the system were chasing its own tail, unable to escape the spiral you created. Analysts described it as a paradox loop. The program, designed to find probabilities, encountered a point where probability no longer applied. Instead of advancing forward, it folded back upon itself, creating infinite versions of the same unanswered question: how to define a life that refused to be written into code? To the scientists, it was a failure of mathematics. To the generals, it was a threat. But to those who stayed in the chamber that night, watching the screens go black, it felt like a force had stepped between the machine and its calculation, declaring that not all existence could be measured. Each attempt to rerun the algorithm ended in collapse, as though the system itself bowed out of the task, unwilling to trespass further. Some argued that your presence introduced randomness too pure to be simulated, a kind of chaos the machine could not harness. But others sensed that it was not chaos at all. It was order of a higher kind, a structure hidden beneath layers of reality that their programs were never meant to touch. The closer they drew to it, the more their technology faltered, as though pressing against the edge of a veil they were not permitted to cross. Files were drafted, stamped with warnings, and locked under new classification levels. Yet the anomaly could not be contained within paperwork. It gnawed at the minds of those who had seen the collapse firsthand. The question grew larger with every sleepless night. If a machine built to calculate the infinite could not measure you, then what lay beyond that refusal? The Pentagon had trusted its algorithms to map the future of nations. But now, the future itself seemed uncertain, reshaped by a single date that had turned the most powerful sound prediction engine into silence. Buried beneath layers of clearance codes and guarded vaults, the Pentagon stores records not meant for public eyes. These are not simply military strategies or defense technologies, but fragments of history collected from across the world. Scrolls, tablets, and manuscripts that governments confiscated in silence. Among these archives are prophecies written in languages most scholars no longer understand, preserved not for belief, but for control. And when your birth date crashed their quantum system, those in power turned to these forgotten shelves in search of answers. In a dimly lit chamber, specialists unrolled parchments that smelled of ancient earth. They traced lines of faded ink with trembling fingers, comparing symbols to the corrupted data left behind by the machine. What startled them was the resemblance. The very glitches and loops in their system mirrored the symbols carved thousands of years ago. It was as if the collapse of technology had unlocked an echo of words buried in stone. One verse stood out, recorded in fragmented translation. It spoke of a time when the measure of man shall fail, but the one who walks beyond the number shall rise. The analysts did not dare say it aloud in meetings, but in quiet corners they whispered of Yeshua's teachings, the way he defied systems built to control men's lives. His words had carried power that no empire could cage. Before Abraham was, I am. To those who saw the data collapse, the resonance was undeniable. The machine had stumbled upon the same threshold that his voice once shattered. But how could a single person alive today carry weight strong enough to bend both prophecy and code? That was the question gnawing at the minds of the archivists who pieced together the fragments. They knew this could not be explained to the generals as theology. It had to remain under the guise of anomaly research. Yet behind their carefully written reports, unease grew. The prophecies were no longer locked in distant history. They were unfolding in real time, and your name had become the key. The archives whispered that events would spiral once the hidden was brought to light. When the collapse of the quantum system could no longer be ignored, the Pentagon issued a document that only a handful of eyes would ever see. It was stamped with the highest level of secrecy and locked inside a digital vault, accessible only through biometric clearance. The report was not long, but every sentence carried the weight of something unexplainable. It did not frame the event as a glitch, nor as an attack from a foreign power. Instead, it labeled the case under a new category: anomaly, unresolved. The wording was deliberate, chosen with caution. The writers knew this was not a matter of broken code or failed engineering. They recorded the repeated attempts, the infinite loops, the patterns of collapse that emerged each time your birth date was entered into the machine. Diagrams were attached, showing the recursive spirals that replaced usable data. Side by side, comparisons to normal simulations highlighted the impossibility of what had occurred. Buried deeper in the appendices was a section marked for theoretical implications. In it, analysts speculated on what the event suggested about reality itself. They wrote of thresholds, points where technology intersects with forces it cannot command. One theory suggested that existence contains protected frequencies, coordinates shielded from intrusion. Another claimed that consciousness itself had imprinted upon your birth, creating a barrier that no machine could penetrate. The boldest line of all came from a scientist who dared to write, "Subject cannot be calculated because subject does not belong to probability." This line was underlined 3 times in red ink by the reviewing officer. No one removed it. It remained there like a hidden confession, an admission that the Pentagon's strongest tool had bowed before something greater. Copies of the report were distributed to only 3 offices before the document was sealed. Generals demanded silence. Analysts were ordered to destroy rough drafts and wipe personal notes. Yet, memory cannot be erased as easily as paper or data. Those who had seen the report carried its weight with them, unable to dismiss what their own eyes had confirmed. In the days that followed, rumors began to drift beyond the vaults. Not the details, but the sense that something had happened which no defense system could contain. The Pentagon's engineers eventually abandoned the language of errors and turned instead to the concept of frequencies. They noticed that when your birth date was entered, the quantum grid did not simply stop working. It vibrated. The system's internal sensors recorded surges of resonance, oscillations that rippled through circuits like invisible waves. These were not random disruptions. They formed patterns, rhythms, tones. The machine behaved less like a broken computer and more like an instrument struck by a note beyond its range. Specialists brought in equipment designed to detect energy signatures, the same tools used for monitoring particle collisions. What they found unsettled the room. The collapse emitted harmonics that no artificial source should produce. The readings resembled natural resonance, closer to the vibrations of the human voice than to the static hum of machines. It was as though the computer had been made to sing back the echo of your existence, and could not withstand the sound. One of the scientists, unsettled by what he saw, scribbled a line in his private notes. He compared the resonance to a passage he once heard in church. "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." He wrote that the collapse felt less like failure and more like recognition, as if the grid itself had bowed to a voice woven into creation long before circuits were imagined. To him, it was no accident that the harmonics resembled tones attributed to sacred words. But such reflections could never appear in the official documentation. Instead, the data was filed as quantum instability, sealed away with graphs and charts that concealed more than they revealed. Yet, those who witnessed it knew the truth lingered beneath the technical language. The grid had been touched by something outside computation, something that resonated on the same frequency as the breath of life itself. The collapse was not a simple blackout, but a chain reaction that spread through the Pentagon's quantum framework like a pulse of lightning moving across steel. Each node of the grid began to flicker, not from lack of power, but from too much resonance. Technicians described the effect as a wave of interference. Yet what they were really seeing was a frequency strong enough to bend the architecture of their most secure system. The grid was designed to withstand cyber attacks, natural disasters, even intentional overloads. But it had not been designed for a living signal. The first signs appeared in the monitoring hub, where screens trembled with lines of distorted light. Instead of clean numbers, the displays showed loops of spirals repeating into infinity, shapes that mirrored themselves again and again. The operators could only stare, their training useless in the face of something that did not belong to the language of machines. They pulled cables, switched servers, ran emergency resets, but every attempt only spread the resonance further. By dawn, entire sections of the Pentagon's secure network had been quarantined. A hush fell over the building as reports circulated that the anomaly could not be contained in one chamber. The grid itself had memorized the signal, replaying it endlessly in silence. Engineers began to suspect that once the system encountered your birth date, it had not failed, it had learned, and in that learning, it had absorbed a pattern it could not release. The quiet terror among the staff grew heavier with each passing hour. It was no longer about fixing a machine, but about understanding whether the resonance could cross boundaries, move beyond walls, and reach into systems not connected by wire. Some wondered if satellites overhead had already felt the pulse, if the frequencies had already echoed into the sky. Within the Pentagon's innermost archives lies a chamber colder than stone, where documents are locked away not because they are unimportant, but because their very existence threatens the illusion of control. It was there that the final report on the anomaly was hidden, a file so heavily redacted that entire pages appeared as walls of black ink. Yet behind the redactions, buried in layers of clearance, the unedited words remain. Words that admit what no general would speak on record. The system did not fail by chance. It was broken by design of something greater. The secret was never meant to leave that room. It stated plainly that your birth date carried a resonance untraceable by science, one that echoed with the patterns of prophecies long dismissed. The Analysts confessed in writing that their strongest technology could not map you, and in their desperation they searched outside of science for parallels. In footnotes, almost hidden, they cited the words of Yeshua. "The wind blows where it wills, and you hear its sound, but cannot tell where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. The choice to include that line was not a mistake. It was the whispered admission of a mind that knew the collapse was not random energy, but spirit itself, refusing to be bound by probability. For those who read it, the truth became undeniable. A living presence had entered their machine, not to be captured, but to remind them that destiny cannot be programmed. The generals ordered silence. They swore their teams to secrecy under threat of prison, career, or worse. But secrets have a way of burning through the paper meant to bury them. The truth lingers in the memory of those who saw the screens go black, who felt the resonance vibrate in their very bones, who read the scripture slipped between lines of technical jargon. The file is still there, sealed beneath levels of security that only a handful will ever touch. But the resonance it describes is not locked away. It moves, it stirs, it waits. And as those who tried to bury the truth know too well, a secret written into the fabric of creation cannot stay hidden forever.
If you have come this far, it is crucial that you watch this next video here. But be warned, it is not for the faint of heart, for only the true chosen ones can handle this video. If you would like to also donate to help keep the channel going, our Buy Me a Coffee link will be in the description.